Hi everyone, Mr. Allen here. Around this time of year, I get a lot of questions about final grades, and students are kind of worried about what kind of effect the exam or summative assessment might have on their mark. So I thought I'd kind of quickly go through the calculations just to give you an idea of how to figure this out for yourself. So in Ontario, all of our marks are based on a 70% term mark and a 30% summative or exam mark. You can make adjustments to what I'm about to show you if you happen to be looking at somewhat of a different breakdown. But essentially, this is what we're looking at. Our final grade will be 70% based on the term mark, plus 30% based on the exam or, again, summative assessment. Okay, so if we look at an example, let's assume we had a mark of 80% on the term and 60% for the exam. And so the calculation looks like this. The final grade will be 0.7, so 70% of the mark is an 80, 30% of the mark is a 60, and that works out to be 56 plus 18, which is a 74. Okay, so the thing I want you to notice here is when I started off with an 80 and dropped 20% with my exam, so my exam was 20% lower than my term, it still only made about a 6% difference in my final grade. So there's almost a 3-to-1 here. Well, there's about a 3-to-1 here in how far I have to drop before there's a significant effect on my grade. So if my exam is 3% lower than my term, I drop by about 1 mark, 6% lower, I drop by about 2 marks, and so on. So just look at a couple of others here that are already done. In this example, pretty similar, except there's an 80% term and a 77% exam. Calculations look the same to start, 23.1 over here now. So that's to say I've got 23 marks out of a possible 30 on the exam. And when I add those up, we see 79 ends up being my mark. So again, 3% lower on the exam than on the term, but it only made about a 1% difference on the final report. One more here, 65% term, 50% exam, exact same calculation. 0.7 times the 65, 0.3 times the 50, and you see I had 45.5 from this, plus 15 more gives me a 60 overall. Now the key here, this red value, 45.5, is the number of marks that I've already locked up going into the exam based on my term. So if I had 65% as my term mark, I am guaranteed 45.5 marks on my final report card, which is to say I basically only need 5 more marks in order to pass the course. If I got 0 on the exam, I would end up with a 45 final. Similarly, on the previous one, when I had 80% going into the exam, I had locked up a 56. So if I got 0 on the exam, I would have had 56 marks plus 0 more marks, means 56 is the final. So this is guaranteed marks on your report card, and then this, whatever you do on the exam, is basically added on to that value. Last one here, 70% is kind of a key number. So if I had a 70% on my term mark, now don't confuse this with the 70% here. So this is saying my mark on my last progress report was a 70. It's still worth 70% of my final mark. So again, 70% of 70 means I've locked up 49 marks. And in order to pass the course, I only need sort of 3% more, say, I guess 1 more here, but around 3% on the exam to pass the course. So if I have a 70 going into the exam, I really don't need to do anything on the exam to pass the course. Although a really mean teacher might give you your 49 and actually fail you if you got 0 on the exam. So how can we use this? If we're sort of trying to figure out, based on my term mark, what would I need to get in order to get a 50, in order to get a 60, in order to get a 55? We can take the mark that we know from the term. So here I'm using an example of a 58% on the term. 0.7 times that 58 means, again, this student has locked up 40.6 marks. So a 0 on the exam would leave them with a 40.6. If they're interested or concerned about possibly passing, and I suppose if you had a 58 term, you might sort of have some concern about passing the class. You need essentially 9.4 more marks to get this 40.6 to a 50 even. And that is to say that, I've hidden something over here, there we go. We need to get 9.4 out of the possible 30 marks on the exam, or again, approximately 32% on the exam in order to pass. So you can see here, even with a 58 term, which isn't a great mark compared to a 50 pass, I still only need 32% on the exam to actually pass the course. If I'm interested in raising my mark from a 58 to a 60, for example, I now need 19.4, because I need to get this number and this number to add to 60. So I need to get 19.4 out of the possible 30 marks. So essentially I'm saying I need the 19.4 out of that possible 30 marks. And since 20 out of 30 would be 67%, that means this is basically 65, 66% that I need to get on the exam to raise my mark from a 58 to a 60. If I was looking to raise my mark from a 58 to a 70, well, then I need 29.4 marks, or essentially 94 or 96% maybe on the exam to do that, unless the teacher's going to do some sort of adjusting of the marks based on my brilliant exam. Okay, so hopefully that sort of at least puts people's minds at ease a little bit if they were concerned about the possibility of failing. If you're passing your course going into the exam, or passing somewhat comfortably, the chances of you failing are quite slim. Not impossible, but quite slim. And if you're in the range of, as we saw, something like 70%, you essentially cannot fail the course at that point. You can drop significantly. Obviously, getting a 3% on your exam when you had a 70 term would be rather disappointing. It would leave you with a 50% final, but still not a failing mark.